You will never be my true wife." The words echoed like a verdict across the grand hall, sharp enough to silence even the oldest vampires in the room. And for a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath as Clara Whitmore stood alone beneath a ceiling of crystal chandeliers that glittered like frozen stars, her worn shoes planted on marble floors that had never known someone like her, her fingers trembling slightly at her sides, not from fear, but from the weight of a life that had led her here, a life of double shifts. Unpaid bills and nights spent staring at a cracked ceiling, wondering how survival had become her only dream. And now she stood before Lucien Voss, the Vampire King, a man who had ruled for centuries, whose presence could turn a crowded room into a graveyard of silence, whose pale face revealed nothing and everything at once, his silver eyes colder than winter steel, watching her as if she were both insignificant and dangerous at the same time. And yet Clara did not lower her gaze. Not completely. Not in the way everyone expected, because something in her refused to break. Even now, even here, even after being reduced to nothing more than a political arrangement dressed in a borrowed gown that didn't quite fit her shoulders, whispers began to spread like cracks in glass. Nobles leaning toward one another, their voices low and sharp, amused, curious, cruel, waiting for her to cry, to beg, to collapse under the weight of humiliation. But Clara simply inhaled, slow and steady, the way she used to when everything felt like it was falling apart, the way her mother once taught her before the world took everything else away. And then she spoke, her voice soft but clear enough to reach the edges of the hall. "Then I will fulfill the role you require, Your Majesty." And that was the moment something shifted, subtle but undeniable, because that was not the response anyone had prepared for, not the reaction Lucien himself had anticipated. His gaze flickered, just for a fraction of a second, something unreadable passing through those ancient eyes, and before the silence could settle again, a small sound broke through it, a faint, uneven breath, almost lost beneath the weight of the room, and then a child stumbled forward from the shadows of the throne. Small, pale, his movements unsteady as if the world itself overwhelmed him. The vampire prince, the one no servant dared approach, the one even nobles avoided, his eyes wide with something between fear and confusion, and instantly the tension in the room snapped tight, guards stiffened, nobles froze, no one moved, no one dared, because this was not a moment to interfere, not a moment to risk anything. But Clara moved, before she could think, before she could stop herself, one step, then another, crossing a distance that felt far longer than a few feet, kneeling beside the child as if the entire court did not exist, as if the king himself was not watching, her hand reaching out slowly, gently, giving the boy time to pull away if he wanted to. But he didn't, and the instant her fingers brushed his, everything changed. The boy's breathing steadied. The tension left his small frame, and a silence deeper than before fell over the hall. A silence filled not with fear, but with something else. Something no one could name. And for the first time in decades, Lucien Voss rose from his throne. The moment Lucien Voss stepped down from his throne, the air itself seemed to shift, as if the ancient stone walls of the citadel recognized that something unprecedented had just occurred. His movements slow, deliberate, each step echoing with a quiet authority that made even the oldest nobles lower their eyes. Yet his gaze never left Clara, not for a second, not as the court parted before him, not as whispers dissolved into absolute silence, because what stood before him no longer fit into any category he had known for centuries, not servant, not pawn, not threat, but something far more dangerous, something he could not yet understand. And Clara felt it, the weight of his attention pressing against her like a physical force. But she did not pull her hand away from the child, even as every instinct warned her that she should, because the small fingers still clung to hers, trusting, steady, as if her presence alone had anchored him to the world. And that simple, impossible trust made something tighten in her chest, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. "What did you do?" Lucien's voice was quieter now, but no less commanding, and for a moment Clara considered. Lying, considered stepping back into the safety of invisibility. But she knew it would be useless, because men like him saw through weakness the way others saw through glass. So she answered honestly, "Nothing, Your Majesty. I only did what anyone should." A murmur rippled through the hall at her words. Disbelief, confusion, even faint irritation, because nothing about this was normal. Nothing about this could be explained by kindness alone. Lucien's eyes narrowed slightly, studying the way the child remained calm, the way his breathing had steadied, the way his usual restlessness had simply vanished. And then, without warning, the boy shifted closer to Clara, his grip tightening as if he feared she might disappear. And that was when the reaction truly began. Nobles stepping back, some in shock, others in quiet alarm, because they all understood what this meant even if Clara did not. The prince did not touch anyone. Not willingly, not without distress, not without consequence. And yet, here he was, holding onto a human girl as if she were the only safe place in the room. Impossible. Someone whispered, the word barely audible but heavy with meaning. Lucien raised a hand and the entire court fell silent instantly, his attention never wavering. And for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, there was something different in his expression. Not warmth, not softness, but a fracture in the perfect control he had maintained for centuries. "Bring the records," he said, his voice cutting clean through the tension. "I want everything on her." Clara's breath caught, not from fear alone, but from the sudden realization that whatever had just happened had changed something fundamental. Not just for her, but for him, for the entire court, for a world she had never meant to enter. And as Lucien stopped just a few feet away, close enough that she could see the faint shimmer beneath his pale skin, close enough to feel the cold radiating from him like a winter night, he spoke again, quieter this time, meant only for her. "From this moment on, Clara Whitmore, you are no longer invisible." And though the words should have sounded like a warning, something in his tone made them feel like the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because for the first time, the most powerful man in the room was not looking through her. He was looking at her, as if she had become the one variable he could not control. The hall did not return to normal after that. It could not, because something invisible had shifted in the balance of power, something no law or title could explain, and Clara felt it in the way every gaze now followed her, not with mockery, but with a cautious, calculating curiosity, as if she had become a question no one knew how to answer. The child still stood beside her, his small hand wrapped around her fingers with quiet determination. And even when a servant approached hesitantly, he did not let go, did not look away, did not acknowledge anyone else. And that alone unsettled the court more than any display of strength ever could. "Your Highness," a noblewoman said carefully, her voice smooth but strained. Perhaps the girl should step back, but the moment Clara even shifted her weight, the boy's grip tightened, his calm beginning to fracture. And instantly the room tensed again, because they all understood what that meant. And Clara, without thinking, simply whispered, "It is all right, I am here." Her voice soft, steady, the same tone she had once used to comfort herself in empty apartments and quiet nights. And just like before, the tension melted away, the child's breathing evening out as if her word alone carried some unseen authority. Lucien watched all of it in silence, his mind moving faster than anyone could perceive, centuries of knowledge, patterns, rules, all failing to explain what stood before him, because there were only two possibilities. Either this was a coincidence beyond reason, or Clara Whitmore was something far more significant than she appeared, and Lucien did not believe in coincidences. Not anymore. Not after everything he had lived through. "Escort the prince to the East Wing," he ordered at last, his voice returning to that calm, absolute control that defined him. But when the attendants stepped forward, the boy did not move, his eyes remaining fixed on Clara, silent, unyielding, and for a brief moment, something like frustration flickered across Lucien's expression before vanishing just as quickly. "She will accompany him," he added, and that single decision sent another wave through the court, sharper this time, because now it was no longer an anomaly. It was recognition, a shift in status that no one had approved, no one had expected, and certainly no one had the power to challenge. Clara hesitated only for a second before nodding, because despite everything, despite the fear curling quietly in her chest, she could not bring herself to pull away from the child, not when he looked at her like she was the only thing keeping the world from becoming too much. And as they began to walk, the vast hall stretching endlessly around them, Clara became aware of the silence again. But this time, it was different, heavier, filled with unspoken tension. And just before she reached the doors, Lucien's voice stopped her low, controlled, but impossible to ignore. "Clara," he said, her name unfamiliar on his lips, as if he were testing it, measuring it. And when she turned back, she found him watching her with that same intensity. But now there was something else beneath it, something sharper, more focused. "Do not mistake this for kindness," he continued. "I protect what is mine." The words should have been cold, possessive, even distant, but Clara did not feel fear when she heard them. Not entirely, because something in his gaze betrayed the truth he had not spoken, that this was not control. Not yet. This was uncertainty. And for the first time, the Vampire King did not fully understand the world in front of him. And somehow, impossibly, that world had begun to revolve around her. The doors of the great hall closed behind Clara with a heavy echo that seemed to seal her fate inside a world she had never belonged to, yet now could not escape. And as she walked beside the small prince through corridors lined with ancient stone and flickering candlelight, she became acutely aware of how quiet everything was, not the ordinary quiet of night, but a watchful silence, as if the castle itself was observing her, measuring her presence with every step she took, the child still holding her hand with unwavering trust, guiding her rather than being guided. And Clara allowed it, because for the first time since entering this place, she felt something steady, something human in the midst of all this cold perfection. "What is your name?" she asked gently, her voice barely above a whisper, and for a moment she wondered if he would answer at all. But then he looked up at her, his eyes clearer now, no longer clouded with distress. "Elias," he said softly, and the simple sound of it seemed to settle something deep within her. Elias, a name that felt warm despite everything around them. "That is a strong name," she replied, offering a small, genuine smile, the kind she had not used in years, not since life had taught her how expensive kindness could be. And yet here, it came naturally, as if this moment demanded nothing less. When they reached the East Wing, the atmosphere shifted again, quieter, more contained, guards standing at attention with expressions carefully neutral. Though their eyes betrayed the same confusion and unease that had spread through the court, they stepped aside without question, without challenge, because orders from the king were absolute. But Clara could feel it, the tension, the disbelief, the silent question of who she was to walk these halls so freely. And as they entered the prince's chamber, she paused, taking in the space. It was vast, far larger than any room she had ever lived in, with tall windows draped in heavy fabric, a bed that looked untouched by time, and shelves filled with objects that hinted at a life lived in quiet isolation. Elias did not let go of her hand even then. Instead, he moved closer, as if the room itself was less comforting than her presence. And Clara understood that feeling more than she wanted to admit, because she had known rooms like that, places that looked safe but never felt like home. "You can rest now," she said gently, kneeling slightly to meet his eyes, but he shook his head, a small, stubborn motion. "Stay," he whispered, and the word carried more weight than it should have, because it was not a request born from fear, but from something deeper, something that recognized her in a way no one else had. And Clara hesitated, just for a moment, because staying meant crossing another invisible line, one she could not uncross. But before she could decide, the door behind her opened silently, and she did not need to turn to know who it was. The air itself shifted, colder, sharper, and Lucien Voss stepped into the room, his presence filling the space without effort, his gaze moving first to the child, confirming what he already knew, that Elias was calm, stable, unchanged by the transition, and then to Clara, studying her again with that same intensity, But now there was something new layered beneath it. Not just curiosity, but calculation, as if he were beginning to place her within a framework he had yet to define. "Leave us," he said to the guards, and the door closed once more, sealing the three of them in silence that felt far more intimate than the crowded hall ever had. Clara straightened slowly, aware of every detail, every movement, every breath. As Lucien took a step closer, not threatening, not gentle, simply inevitable. "You will stay," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Yet it was not a command driven by authority alone. There was something else beneath it, something he did not name, could not name, and Clara realized then that this was no longer about duty or politics or appearances. This was about something far more dangerous, because the king who controlled everything had just encountered something he could not control at all. Clara did not answer immediately, not because she did not understand, but because she understood too well what those words meant and the weight behind them, because staying here was no longer a temporary arrangement or a role she could quietly endure. It was something else entirely, something that would reshape her life in ways she could not predict. And yet when she looked down at Elias, still standing close, still holding on to her, as if she were the only constant in a world that had never made sense to him, the choice did not feel like a choice at all. "All right," she said softly, the words simple, but final, and for a brief second, something flickered in Lucien's expression, so quickly it might have been imagined, but Clara felt it, the shift, the smallest fracture in the perfect control he carried like armor, as if her agreement had not followed the outcome he expected. Because this was not fear, not submission, this was something quieter, steadier, and far more difficult to command. Lucien turned slightly, his gaze moving to Elias, observing the way the boy had not once shown distress since Clara's presence anchored him. And that alone altered the equation in his mind, centuries of experience telling him that this was not coincidence, not chance, but a pattern he had yet to fully see. "You will be given quarters here," he said, his tone measured, controlled, returning to the structure he understood. "You will not leave this wing without permission." It sounded like a restriction, but Clara recognized it for what it truly was: protection, not just for her, but for whatever unknown force now tied her to this place. And before she could respond, Elias tugged lightly at her hand, drawing her attention back to him. His voice quiet but certain. "Stay tonight," he said, and Clara hesitated again. Not because she feared the request, but because she was beginning to realize that every small decision she made here carried consequences far beyond her understanding. Lucien watched the exchange without interruption. But his silence was not passive. It was deliberate, calculating, because he was no longer observing from a distance. He was studying her, every word, every reaction, every moment where she chose instinct over caution. And what he saw did not align with anything he had prepared for. Not weakness, not ambition, not deception, but something far more rare, something that did not bend under pressure. Clara finally nodded, her voice steady. "I will stay," and Elias relaxed instantly, the tension leaving his shoulders in a way that confirmed everything Lucien needed to know. And for the first time, the king understood that whatever connection existed here was not superficial, not temporary. It was binding in a way even his ancient laws could not yet define. He stepped closer then, stopping just within reach, his presence no longer distant, no longer abstract, but real, immediate, undeniable. "You believe this is kindness," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on hers, searching, measuring, but kindness does not change blood. It does not calm what cannot be calmed. His voice lowered further, almost thoughtful now, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. "And yet you did." Clara met his gaze without flinching, despite the instinct that told her she should look away, because something in her refused to be diminished. "Not here. Not now. Maybe it is not about blood," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "Maybe it is about being seen." The words lingered in the air between them, fragile, dangerous, because they challenged something far deeper than authority, and Lucien stilled, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but Clara saw it, felt it, the moment those words reached something buried beneath centuries of control, and for the first Time. The silence that followed was not one of power, but of uncertainty, because the vampire king, who understood everything, suddenly found himself facing something he did not understand at all. Lucien did not respond to her words right away, and that silence stretched longer than it should have, not empty, but filled with something heavy, something unfamiliar, as if her simple answer had reached past the surface of everything he believed and touched something far older, far more buried. And, for a brief moment, the king who commanded entire worlds stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on Clara, as if recalculating a truth he had accepted for centuries, because being seen was not a concept his world was built upon. It was built on power, on blood, on control, and yet what he had just witnessed defied all three. Elias shifted slightly beside Clara, his grip loosening just enough to show comfort rather than need, and that alone confirmed what Lucien could no longer deny. This connection was real, not imagined, not temporary, and it was happening in a way that did not obey any rule he knew. "You speak as if you understand this place," Lucien said finally, his voice quieter now, less like a command and more like a question wrapped in steel, and Clara shook her head gently, a faint, almost tired smile touching her lips. "I do not understand this place," she admitted, "but I understand what it feels like to be alone in a room full of people." The words landed differently this time, not as a challenge, but as something closer to truth, something that did not need to fight to be heard. And Lucien's expression shifted again, subtle, controlled, but not untouched, because there was a time, long before memory had turned into something distant and cold, when he had known that feeling too, though he had buried it so deeply it no longer felt real. The room fell quiet again, but this silence was not tense, not uncertain. It was reflective, as if the space itself had paused to absorb what had just been said, and Elias, still watching Clara, slowly released her hand, not out of fear, but because he no longer needed to hold on so tightly. He moved toward the bed, climbing onto it with a quiet ease that had not been present before, and for the first time, he looked at Lucien without hesitation, without the guarded distance that had defined every interaction they had shared until now. And that alone was enough to shift something deeper within the king, something he did not show, but could not ignore. Clara stepped back slightly, giving the child space, her movements calm, deliberate, never rushed, and Lucien noticed that too. The way she did not try to control the moment, did not demand it, but allowed it to unfold naturally. And that was something far more dangerous than force, because it could not be predicted, could not be countered. "You will remain here," Lucien said again, but this time the words were different, not in order, not entirely, but something closer to acknowledgement. "Not because I command it," he added, almost as an afterthought, "but because this is where you are needed." Clara looked at him, then, truly looked, past the authority, past the centuries of control, and for the first time she saw it clearly. Not weakness, not softness, but a question, a rare, unspoken question that the vampire king himself did not yet know how to ask, and instead of answering it directly, she simply nodded, a quiet agreement that carried more weight than any declaration, because it was not given out of obligation, but out of choice, and that was something Lucien had not encountered in a very long time. The candles flickered slightly as a draft moved through the room, casting shifting shadows across the walls, and in that moment, something subtle but undeniable settled into place. Not a resolution, not yet, but the beginning of a change that none of them could fully see, because for the first time in centuries, the balance of power was no longer defined by strength alone, but by something far quieter, far more enduring, and far more impossible to control. Night settled over the east wing with a quiet stillness that felt almost unreal, as if the castle itself had exhaled after centuries of holding its breath, and Clara sat beside the tall window, watching the distant lights flicker beyond the stone walls, her reflection faint against the glass, pale, tired, but steadier than she had been in a long time. Behind her, Elias rested against the pillows, not asleep, but calm in a way that no one in this place seemed to understand, his eyes following her, with a quiet certainty that did not demand attention, only presence. And that alone was enough to keep her from leaving, even when every instinct reminded her how dangerous it was to remain here, because this was no longer about survival. It was about something deeper, something that had begun the moment she chose not to look away. The door opened without sound, and Clara did not need to turn to know who had entered. The air shifted again, colder, sharper, but no longer unfamiliar. Lucien stepped into the room, his presence cutting through the quiet like a line drawn in stone. Yet there was something different in the way he stood, not distant, not entirely removed, but watching, as if observing a scene he had not anticipated. "You should rest," he said, his voice low, controlled, but lacking the edge it carried before. And Clara shook her head slightly, her gaze still on the window. "I am not tired," she replied, though the truth was more complicated than that, because it was. Not her body that resisted rest. It was her mind, still trying to understand how everything had changed so quickly. Lucien stepped closer, his reflection now appearing beside hers in the glass. Pale, precise, almost unreal. "You are in a place where nothing is given freely," he said after a moment. Not as a warning, but as a fact, and Clara turned then, meeting his gaze without hesitation, and yet something was. She answered quietly, and the words lingered between them, challenging but not confrontational, and Lucien did not dismiss them, did not correct her, because part of him knew she was not entirely wrong, and that was the part he could not ignore. Behind them, Elias shifted again, drawing their attention, and for the first time since entering the room, he spoke without hesitation, his voice small but clear. "She stays," he said, not asking, not uncertain, but stating something he believed to be true. And Lucien looked at him, really looked, seeing not just his son, but the change that had taken place, the calm that had replaced the distance, the trust that had formed without permission or control, and that alone made his next words unavoidable. "She stays," Lucien repeated, quieter now, not as a command, but as acceptance, and something in the room settled with that, not visibly, not dramatically, but undeniably, as if a new rule had just been written into existence. Clara felt it too, though she could not name it, only sense that whatever line had separated her from this world had been crossed, not by force, but by something far more irreversible. And as Lucien turned to leave, pausing only for a fraction of a second at the door, he spoke again, his voice softer than it had ever been. "This changes nothing." But even as he said it, the truth stood quietly behind the words, unspoken, undeniable, that everything had already begun to change. And for the first time, it was not the king who decided how morning did not arrive with sunlight in the east wing, only with a subtle shift in the darkness, a quiet thinning of shadows that hinted at time passing beyond the stone walls. And Clara realized she had not slept at all, yet she did not feel the usual exhaustion that came from long nights. Instead, there was a strange clarity, as if something inside her had settled into place without her. Noticing, Elias was still resting, his breathing even, peaceful in a way that felt almost fragile, and Clara remained seated nearby, not out of duty, but because leaving no longer felt like an option she could consider. The door opened again, this time with a soft knock that felt almost formal, and a woman entered, dressed in deep crimson with a posture that spoke of authority, her gaze sharp, assessing, but not openly hostile. "Clara Whitmore," she said, her voice calm but edged with something unreadable. "I am Lady Seraphine." The name carried weight. Even Clara could feel it, not from knowledge, but from the way the air seemed to shift around it. "His Majesty has ordered that you be prepared for presentation this evening." Clara blinked slightly, the words not immediately making sense. "Presentation," she repeated, and Lady Seraphine inclined her head just enough to acknowledge the question. "The court will require explanation," she said, "and they will expect to see what has altered the prince's condition." The phrasing was precise, deliberate, and Clara understood then that whatever had happened last night had not been contained. It had spread, and now it would be examined, questioned, possibly challenged. Her instinct was to refuse, to step back from something she did not understand. But before she could speak, Elias stirred, his eyes opening slowly, and the moment he saw Clara, Something softened instantly, the lingering distance gone as if it had never existed. "You are still here," he said quietly, and Clara nodded, offering a small reassurance that felt more important than anything else in that moment. "I said I would stay," she replied, and that seemed to settle something deeper than words could reach. Lady Seraphine observed the exchange in silence, her expression shifting ever so slightly. Not warmth, not approval, but recognition, as if she too understood that this was not a performance, not something that could be easily explained or controlled. "You will need to be ready within 2 hours," she said finally, her tone returning to formality. "The king does not repeat his decisions." And with that, she turned and left, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Clara alone once more with the weight of what was coming. She exhaled slowly, her hands resting loosely in her lap as she tried to steady her thoughts, because whatever happened next would not be quiet, would not be contained. It would be public, watched, judged, and she would stand at the center of it without understanding why. Elias shifted again, sliding closer to the edge of the bed, his voice softer now, but certain. "They will not like you," he said, not cruelly, not fearfully, simply stating something he already knew. Clara let out a small breath that almost resembled a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That makes 2 of us," she replied gently, and for a brief moment the tension eased, but it did not disappear, because beyond these walls, the court was already preparing, already deciding, already questioning what she was and what she meant. And as Clara stood slowly, looking toward the door that would soon lead her back into that world, she understood something clearly for the first time. This was no longer about surviving a moment. It was about facing everything that came after it, and somewhere, in the depths of the castle, Lucien Voss was already waiting. The great hall felt different when Clara stepped into it again, not because it had changed, but because she had, and every step she took across the marble floor carried a weight that had not been there before, the chandeliers above casting cold light across rows of watching faces, noble seated. In perfect stillness, their eyes sharp, curious, measuring, no longer dismissing her as invisible, but studying her as something far more complicated, something that did not fit into their world. Clara kept her posture steady, her movements controlled, not out of confidence, but out of necessity, because she understood now that every detail mattered, every breath, every glance. And at the far end of the hall, Lucien Voss stood beside his throne, not seated, not distant, but present, waiting, his gaze finding hers immediately, holding it without hesitation, as if everything else in the room had faded into something irrelevant. Lady Seraphine's voice broke the silence, formal, precise. "The court convenes to witness the matter concerning the human Clara Whitmore and the condition of the prince." The words echoed, structured, controlled, but beneath them ran a current of tension that no one could fully conceal. Clara felt it in the way the room seemed to lean toward her, waiting, expecting, questioning, and for a moment, she considered how easily this could turn, how quickly curiosity could become rejection. But then she felt a small hand slip into hers, steady, grounding, and she did not need to look to know Elias stood beside her, calm, present, unchanged, and that alone shifted something in the room again, a ripple of disbelief passing through the court, because they could see it now, not just hear about it, not just question it, but witness it, the impossible made visible. Lucien stepped forward then, his voice cutting clean through the silence. "You have seen the result," he said, not loudly, but with an authority that required no volume. "The prince stands without distress." A murmur spread, restrained but undeniable, and one of the elder nobles rose slightly, his expression composed but tense. "Your Majesty, with respect, this anomaly cannot be accepted without explanation." His words were careful, chosen, but the meaning beneath them was clear. This was not about curiosity, it was about control, about understanding what could not be allowed to exist without definition. Lucien's gaze did not shift, did not waver, then observe. He replied simply, and for a moment no one moved, until Clara felt Elias's hand tighten slightly, not in fear, but in quiet reassurance, and she understood what was being asked without it being spoken. She knelt gently beside him, her movements calm, unforced, and placed her hand lightly over his, just as she had before, and the room held its breath, watching, waiting, searching for any sign of failure, any crack in what they had witnessed. But none came. The child remained steady, peaceful, his gaze clear, and the silence that followed was deeper than anything that had come before, because now there was no denying it, no dismissing it as chance. It was real, undeniable, and for the first time, uncertainty spread not through whispers, but through stillness. Lucien turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the court, measuring their reactions, their calculations, their unspoken fears. And then he spoke, his voice steady, final. She remains. The words fell in a place like a decree carved into stone, not open for debate, not subject to approval. And though no one challenged him directly, the tension in the room did not disappear. It shifted, becoming something quieter, more dangerous. Because acceptance was not the same as agreement. Clara rose slowly, aware of every eye, still fixed on her, but something inside her had changed as well. Something steadier, stronger, not power, not status, but presence. And as she met Lucien's gaze once more, she understood that whatever this was, whatever had begun between them, it was no longer something either of them could walk away from. Because sometimes the strongest force in a world built on power was not power at all, but the quiet, unyielding choice to remain.